go. So before I get started, what a beautiful facility. And it was a little bit of a homecoming for me. I went to college at UC Irvine, so I did my undergraduate and graduate degree there. And when I was in grad school, I lived at Newport Bay Terrace, which is basically just right down the street on this corner. And I learned to play golf at the little 9-hole course right here. And so it was when I looked it up on the map of where I was going, I just started recognizing all of these. I was like, I've been there before, and I realized it was because I spent a really, really fun couple of years living right around the corner. So it was really fun to come in today. And thank you to Melanie for letting me come and take up a little bit of your time on a Saturday, and hopefully you find some of this interesting and informative. And it sounds like you guys are definitely at the earliest phases in this in terms of the general plan update, and so some of this stuff is going to feel really far down the road, but I guess my hope would be that you kind of remember it when you guys do get to that point, and then we'll have the presentation available and you can always refer back to it. So this little statement here is straight from the Fullerton plan. A vision without a plan is just a dream. And that's a little bit hokey, I'll admit it. But if you think about it, that's really kind of a driving component when you're developing a general plan. And if all the document does is get written up and a lot of kudos and a city council says, great job everybody, adopted, and they put that big binder on a desk or they display it someplace and we never open it up again, we never look at it, we never talk about how we're implementing it, then really it was just a dream for how Newport or any city is going to develop. So,
does Fullerton have a pier like
no, this is
that an aspirational?
This is an aspiration. You've heard of sea level rise. We are only 2 gigantic tsunamis away from having it. No, this is called pandering to your audience. And it's a beautiful picture. So a couple of topics I'm going to cover today, and I'll try to stay on agenda. To talk real briefly about components of a general plan, sort of a brief overview. What does the government code say? What are the required elements? Melanie touched on that a little bit. Then I'm going to give you the abbreviated history of the development of Fullerton's general plan. As Melanie said, it was adopted in May of 2012. They embarked on the journey starting in 2007, so it was a 5-year process. All of you will no doubt remember that 2009 to 2012 was a little bit ugly with the recession, and so that definitely slowed the process because the city, like many cities, had a lot of other things going on, and so updating a general plan took a little bit of a backseat for a few years, but it's not an understatement to say that it does take several years to really prepare a comprehensive general plan. Then really what's most important, I'm going to talk about what's great, what I like about it, what we like about it, and then a couple of notes about what's not so great, because I think there's always learning experiences, there's always takeaways, and anything that we can provide to Newport Beach and any other city that makes your general plan that much better, that much more user-friendly, that much more implementable, really is good for everybody. And so we're happy to always share those negative experiences as well. And then I'm going to talk a couple of case studies, which we're calling use and implications. And it's really some examples of how the general plan, after it got adopted, how the city staff and the elected officials have used the general plan to actually make land use decisions, which is ultimately the goal. Uh-oh, did my thing die? Uh-oh. Oh, now I'm all over the place. Here we go. So, before I get too much further, full disclosures. I don't know anything about the coastal plans, coastal commissions, coastal documents. I would love to live by the coast. I would love to work by the coast, but I never have. All the cities that I've worked for have been outside of the coastal region. So if you ask me a question about that, I'll lie to you. I'll make something up, or I'll just look dumbfounded. So
you were looking for a city manager.
I heard it's a closed recruitment and there's not a lot of input, so I don't know. Next thing, general plans are not one size fits all. So what works for Fullerton may or may not work for Newport Beach. I was contacted recently by a city in Northern California that wanted the Word document to our general plan because they were just going to copy replace their city name for our city name, and they thought that would just be a really cost-effective way of updating their general plan. And so I had to kind of very cautiously work through with them to say, you know, we're happy to share our experiences. Not everything works, but every city's different, every community is unique, and even the time when it's created is different. And so while I do think there are lessons to be learned and things that you can always copy, I'm not above copying good ideas. What works for Fullerton may not work for Newport Beach. Next thing, I started in 2015 with the City of Fullerton, so all of the great ideas, all of the wonderful things about this plan were done without me at all. I just get to come in and take advantage of them and talk to you about them, and so really it's a credit to the planners that were working there during that time period. And so I just want to make sure that you guys knew none of these great ideas are my own. And then occasionally, although it might be a little bit less unfiltered now that there's a camera right here, but some of my comments will be sort of unfiltered, and so it's worth noting that these may not be the official position of the City of Fullerton. And so I just wanted to give you guys as much of an open and sort of upfront, casual conversation as possible. So, all right, so disclosures out of the way.
Is it okay to take you from this?
Oh, this is actually my better spot. So you're in the right spot. So,
Thank you.
absolutely. So, what is a general? So, what is a general plan? A general plan, broadly speaking, is a long-range policy document. It guides future development. It is the blueprint. It is the outline. It is the roadmap. You'll hear a lot of those type of ways for what is going to guide the city where the general plan is adopted. The time horizon for general plans is typically 20 years. So Fullerton's previous plan before the 2012 was adopted was 1996. So it made it about 12 years. That's pretty good. I worked for the city of Santa Ana before that. We had general plan elements that were in the early 90s, and it was in 2010. And so it's very difficult to implement a general plan that's over 20 years old. Santa Ana is also just finalizing their comprehensive general plan amendment, and so it's been a long time coming, but it's definitely a process that every city needs to work through. It's a collection of goals and policies, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. There are 7 mandatory elements that I think Melanie had mentioned: land use, circulation, some people call that mobility now, housing, conservation, open space, noise, and safety. And I'll get into a little bit about how Fullerton kind of reinterpreted those 7 required elements, added a lot of our own elements, which you're also allowed to do. And once they're adopted, they have the same force and effect as the mandatory elements in the government code. Lastly, the general plan, in terms of the land use element, it must accommodate the required projected growth that the state of California has and estimates for each city. So there could be a whole separate session on the housing element, which is a mandatory element within the general plan, about how you need to accommodate for housing and population growth. I'm not going to touch on a lot of that today because I said it's a topic you could spend a lot of time on, but I'll touch on it here and there. And then I just like this cartoon about the red tape department. I'm sure Newport is just super streamlined, but everyone else. So who uses the general plan? The short answer, everyone. Everyone uses the general plan. A lot of people don't know about it, but everyone uses it in one way or another, whether they know it or not. City staff, we're using it almost on a daily basis as we're analyzing projects, developing budgets, setting goals. Our residents are typically looking at it, trying to make sure that they can build what they want, what they can and cannot do, what would be the policies, economic development. Elected officials, we sure hope they take a look at it because that's the guiding document for the city. It's going to help them make land use and development decisions. And then local and regional agencies are looking at it. A lot of times the county, SCAG, which is the Southern California Association of Governments, other regional supervisorial districts, a lot of different groups are looking at your city's general plan because they're looking for those policy documents. There are things that expand from city to city, bikeways, circulation, and those are more regional problems, and so they're looking at it in that regard. So, how do the documents work together? So a lot of times you hear about the general plan, you've probably heard maybe about the zoning code, municipal code, zoning maps, and then there's sort of that third level entitlement. So how do all of those pieces work together? The general plan is that 10,000 foot view. It's those policy direction. More specifically, through the land use element, it's defining the type of development and the density. Density can be expressed in units per acre. That's a lot of times when you hear housing, number of units per acre. You'll also hear density expressed as a floor area ratio, or FAR. That's basically a one-story building covering 50% of a property has an FAR of 0.5. A two-story building covering that has an FAR of 0.25. And so it's just a mathematical definition, but that's typically how FAR and density is defined in the general plan. And then if you get down the zoning code, that's what's telling you what the specific uses are. What are the permitted uses in this zone? Residential, commercial, industrial, mixed use, government use. Every city has its own little quirks here and there, but those are general. That's also going to tell you what the setbacks are, how many parking spaces you need, how tall a building can be. Sometimes there's design criteria in there, what type of windows, that kind of thing. And then at the very micro granular level, there's what's called entitlements. This is what the Planning Commission is typically looking at. So you'll hear conditional use permit, variance, specific plan. That Newport Dunes that we were looking at probably went through the Planning Commission for whatever general plan amendments, those kind of things. And that's that regulatory body. Sometimes it's called the zoning administrator, city council, etc. And that's looking for a specific development or activity with specific conditions. So they all kind of work together. And as the little baby says, together, we can do it. So, in a nutshell, how do you make a general plan? Well, it's a recipe. It's a recipe like those delicious chocolate chip cookies. You're going to mix equal parts vision and goals, and that's what that general plan advisory committee, that's what that community outreach, that's what that front end engagement is. You're going to add that to the required general plan elements, those 7 elements there in the middle. Sprinkle in a little bit of the optional elements, so that's urban design, air quality, historic preservation. A lot of them are popular, seismic, and others. And then throw that in the oven, bake it for 15 to 25 years, and hopefully at the end you've implemented a pretty good general plan. So pretty simple recipe. Each one of these pieces can be very complicated, can be very time consuming. So let's get specific to Fullerton. Brief history. We started the process, and when I say we, I mean not me. I was not there. But the city started the process in 2007, actually a little bit before that, with the initiation and education. A General Plan Advisory Committee, or GPAC, was formed, as well as some educational workshops. They held 40 different educational workshops and General Plan Advisory Committee meetings throughout the city. They held them in different places. They held them at different times. They reached out to the business community, the residents, the schools, the youth, any type of group that you could think of. They wanted to reach out and educate. And really what we were trying to do, much like what Melanie is doing here, which I think is fantastic, you're trying to establish that baseline of knowledge so that when everyone comes together and starts offering their advice, their personal experiences, everyone's kind of on a level playing field. We're also doing, yes ma'am.
You said something really crucial for this group. You said the city.
The city.
Reached out and had all of these outreach and education sessions. That's not how we came together. So my question, to make it very, very specific, is when you say the city, do you mean city government was enthusiastic, not enthusiastically supportive of putting this process into motion in 2007?
That is correct. So I cannot speak to their level of enthusiasm, but I can say they were very supportive of a comprehensive community outreach and engagement process. And so, the reason I know that is because they put their money where their mouth is. And community engagement and outreach is expensive and it's time consuming. They held a telephone survey, so they hired a company to put together a survey and do telephone surveys. They paid city staff, like myself and other planners, to go out on weekends and nights and go and attend these meetings. And then most importantly, they hired a consulting firm that specializes in public outreach.
And who was that consulting firm?
I knew you would ask, and I don't recall.
Okay.
But I can definitely get
I'll track you down later.
I'm sure you can. Yes, sir, Alan.
I can't write fast enough. Are copies of these things going to be made available to us?
100%. They are going to be available. The only change you will see from this to what you get is that I did not get copyright permission for those cartoons, and so I have to take those back out of the presentation. But all of the information will be exactly the same. And yes, it's going to go to Melanie right after we're done.
Great.
And it will go to Melanie to make copies?
To put on the website.
We'll get it on the website.
It'll be on the website.
Your website or ours?
SPON.
Yours.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
My website focuses on cats and fun dogs. Cat videos is Matt's website. So, step one, we engaged stakeholders. We actually involved regional and state level. We invited the 4th District Supervisor's Office, which is the district that Fullerton falls into. We invited SCAG, the Orange County Flood Control District, the county, OCTA, Caltrans, you name it. We asked them because we know that a general plan needs to be at both a city level and then some regional components as well.
Excuse me, Matt, how many residents are there in Fullerton now?
There are, according to the last census, there's 140,000.
Thank you.
So that was phase one, kind of setting the groundwork, reaching out, doing that early engagement, leveling the playing field. Phase two was establishing what they called a community vision. They held what's called visioning charrettes, which is just a fancy term for going out, putting out pieces of paper, putting out maps, and asking people, what is it about your neighborhood that you like? What is it about your neighborhood that you hate? What are the things that you want to protect? What are the things that you want to see changed? They went to they called it a road show of presentation, so they're going back out amongst the community. They also did that online and telephone survey. Remember, this is 2007, so online was a little bit more. People still had telephones. I don't know, maybe you guys all have telephones at your house. I'm a cell phone only guy, and if you call and I don't recognize your number, I'm probably not answering. So, but at the time, a telephone survey was coordinated. And then they moved into phase three, so that took about 2 years. If you're looking at a timeline, they spent about 2 years doing that initiate and educate and then establishing the community vision. The plan was developed in outline form in 2009, so that was the city council kind of bought off. This is the general framework, we like it. Planning Commission also signed off, and a couple other commissions and committees. And then we switched from 2000, as you know, the world basically ended in 2009. So I wasn't there, but I think most things kind of went on a shelf for a little while. But safe to say, we spent the next 3 years putting together an administrative draft of the plan that we're going to show you a little bit of today. Took that back through the General Plan Advisory Committee, and then every committee and commission, so the Bike Committee, the Parks and Recreation, you name it. We got about 12 Economic Development Committee, City Council, Planning Commission, etc. And then finally, we came all the way up to May of 2012, and the City Council adopted the general plan. There was also a substantial environmental component, CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. That alone could put all of us to sleep in a heartbeat. It's also worth an entire separate discussion, but suffice to say, there was a program level environmental impact report that was also prepared, and that's required by the state of California in order for the general plan to have any sort of implementation impacts. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm curious because our city in 2014 they were trying to update the land use element, and they did all of those things where they sent out, they did surveys, they did everything, and everything that came back, because I reviewed a lot of that stuff at the time, was no extra traffic, no high-rise development, and they basically blew the whole thing off. The community component. Do you have any suggestions for? I mean, assuming that the same thing happens where they do outreach and people really very strongly said we don't want more traffic, we don't want a lot more development.
Mansionization.
Mansionization, yeah. What would you suggest to do to encourage the city council to actually pay attention to what they get? Because that sounds like your Fullerton people actually paid attention to what the residents want.
Well, I would caveat to say that different people in Fullerton would have a different reaction to that, because they're definitely not. It wasn't just all sunshine and rainbows as we went through the process. Even after the general plan was adopted, there is still a large contingent in Fullerton that hate the general plan as it was adopted for many of those same reasons. They were opposed to higher density residential development, potential traffic impacts, potential gentrification of some of our neighborhoods on the south. And so I think it's really, it's a matter of striking a balance. I would say probably the session that Jennifer Lilly ran back in April is a really, really good example of, you need to, this is Matt Unfiltered, by the way, I'll caveat. Engaging, if you start with no, I don't want any change, I don't want anything new, I don't want any new buildings, it becomes very easy for the city or any government to kind of brush you aside. And so the most successful people, and I'll touch on it again as we go through, and I'll highlight some of those points. The most successful people that worked with our general plan were the ones that started from, let's find a middle ground that we can work together on. And I think that's true at a development level. If you show up to a community meeting or a city council, I'm getting off track, and you just say no, nothing, never, right? I hate everything about this. There's a person in my community that does that. I hate everything about this development. And it's it becomes very simple because the discussion hasn't started, right? We can't meet anywhere in the middle ground if you start with a position of nothing, never, no how. And so there are going to be areas where you might say, I don't want anything to happen here because it's beautiful, it's tidelands, it's whatever. Again, I don't know much about Newport. But you can soften that by saying, but I do think there are areas, I understand growth is going to occur. Let's try to plan it for these specific areas, be strategic in that, so that we're preserving and protecting the areas that need to be preserved and protected. And again, I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. And that's an aspect of Fullerton's general plan that I think is really, it's one of the things that I think is a little bit innovative, and hopefully one of the reasons Melanie invited me today. So, all right, so back to the presentation. I call it, I've termed it the Big Four. So we have 4, instead of taking 7 mandatory elements and then sub-elements, the city and its geniuses that were putting this together said there are 4 overarching components. There is the built environment, so that's buildings, design, mobility, historic preservation, bikes, growth management. Then there's the economy, economic development, and redevelopment. Redevelopment is gone as circa 2011. Again, something that was a little bit uncomfortable to work through in our general plan because it was about right at the halfway point. There's the Fullerton community. This is public safety, health, parks and rec, arts and culture, community involvement, community engagement, which is a really great element that I can touch on a little bit. And then lastly, the natural environment, water, air quality, climate change, waste management, open space, and natural hazards. So the ones that are highlighted in red here, those are the 7 required elements. We called it community development instead of land use. We called it natural resources instead of conservation. We called it mobility instead of circulation, but we're covering the elements that are required by the state law. And then we also layered in a half dozen or so additional elements that were identified by the community in that initiation and education process. So how does it break down? So within the general plan, we have overarching policies. These are 4 policies that are overarching through the whole city. They're mostly sort of aspirational. One is Fullerton is all about local control. So one of the overarching policies is maintain local control whenever possible. One of the overarching policies is look for efficiencies in everything that we're doing. So this is probably coming a lot out of the recession. So economic efficiencies, use of technology. And so these were things that they said, we don't need to put it in individual elements. This applies across the board. And so there's 4 overarching policies. You drop down, the next one is goals. And so these are statements of aspiration or intent. So Fullerton will be a blank, safe community, a community that focuses on education, et cetera, et cetera. Policies, that's where things start to get a little bit more specific. So these are the specific statements within each element that provide direction for decision making. One thing that the Fullerton plan did that I both like and dislike from a staffing perspective, every single policy in the Fullerton general plan starts with support efforts, projects, programs, policies, and regulations, etc. What to do, whatever. And what I like about that is that it's consistent. It speaks to all aspects. As a staff person, what I really don't like about that is there are some policies where that opening sentence doesn't make a damn bit of sense. And so you try to interpret what support efforts, projects, programs, and policies is for something that is not a project, a program, or policy, or a regulation, and it's suddenly, the sentence starts to become very unwieldy. Folks in the public kind of are having a hard time. What do you mean programs that are related to X, Y, and Z? So it was a very interesting thought. It definitely is every policy in our general plan, but it's kind of a double-edged sword. Lastly is actions, and so this is where sort of the rubber meets the road. Specific implementation steps that will lead to the attainment of the goal or policy, and then a specified time frame. And so this is another thing that I haven't seen in a lot of other general plans. At the end of the Fullerton plan, there is called an implementation strategy, and there's a short-term action plan that I'm going to touch on a little bit later that actually said within 3 to 5 years, here's all the actions that we will take to accomplish the policies in this general plan. And so it's as much a roadmap as anything for elected officials and city staff to say, okay, in the first 3 to 5 years, within this element, we're going to do the following things. And then on a regular basis, the concept is that the city council and the community comes back through, reevaluates those, says, here's what we accomplished, here's what we didn't accomplish, here's what we'd like you to focus on now. Things have changed. The rise of rideshare, as an example, maybe needs to be something that we need to consider and plan for that wasn't really in existence when the general plan was first adopted.
So Matt?
Oh, wait, Dennis had his hand up first.
So the policies have an accountability, and there was a measurement. You can look at the council or anybody can look at the policy and say, this policy has been implemented. In other words, that's a measurement. I'm looking for the accountability.
The accountability is in the actions,
not the policy.
not the policy. The policy is specific to a thing, but it doesn't contain that measurability, timeframes, completions.
Got it.
And so the idea is that they build on each other. The policies relate to the goals, the actions relate to the policies, and then if you're down here finishing stuff, that's what's going to tell you, did you achieve the policy, did you not? Yes, ma'am.
So are the 3 to 5 year action plans, is there one for each element? Is that what I heard you say?
There is, and I'm going to show you an example of one.
So is there any action plan, because those elements overlap, right?
They do. And so sometimes there'll be an action, and the example I gave, the action will achieve multiple policies. And so
okay.
there's a lot of cross-referencing.
Thank you.
And so you'll see this action is to implement policy 1.3 in the community development, also satisfies policy 9.6 in economic
So
development.
in your opinion, has this check-in every 3 to 5 years process, has that been fulfilled?
Dorothy, I'm not there yet.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And are there any unintended consequences when you get down to the point of doing actions? Because it's the general plan, and that's how you, to me, it's the I must do this piece. Is that, you know, I could see an unintended consequence where something wasn't done in that time frame, and you could have somebody that comes back and files a lawsuit, or, you know, I mean, it seems to me that it could create unintended consequences. Hasn't it?
And it has.
Okay.
And I will talk about them in a moment. Yes, sir. I clearly should have reorganized my presentation.
Some of those things you've mentioned, decisions are highly controversial in Newport Beach. And we may end up putting something in there which is what 60% of the people want, and 40% are vehemently opposed to it and don't want it in the general plan. Does the general plan in any way recognize and cope with that situation, or what do you do about it? Or just weasel word your way through without making any decision?
Well, I think the number one, I would say that is the role of elected officials. Sometimes very difficult decisions, couple council people in the audience. The role of an elected official is to make that hard decision. And so at the end of the day, this is a document that they have to own as much as the community and the staff have to own. And if there's a general plan policy or action that 50% of the people like and 50% of the people hate, at some point a decision maker needs to decide whether or not that's going to move forward. One way around that, as you eloquently put, is to broaden the policy a little bit so that there's a little bit more flexibility in how that action is actually implemented.
That's exactly our problem. If you leave room for discretion, you've left room for indiscretion, and the people who buy the city council get a lot of indiscretion adopted.
Fair statement.
Welcome to our town.
Love it.
So my question is on that short-term action plan. It's part of the implementation section.
Yep.
And you said it lasts 3 to 5 years, and so we're 6 years after this plan has been adopted.
We are.
And so are you 3 to 5 years later modifying your new set of goals, or how is that coming up
I
too?
actually wish I hadn't mentioned it because I'm going to get to it.
Okay.
Yeah. The short answer.
Well, you know we're
the short-
paying attention.
Yes, you guys are doing excellent, and you've keyed on a aspect of our general plan that could use improvement.
Okay.
So I'm going to touch
got
on it.
it.
I will
Good
touch
to
on
know.
it. I promise.
We want to learn your lesson.
If I somehow miss it at the end, catch me. All right. So another thing about the Fullerton plan that I do think. Oh, yes, ma'am.
One more. So, in that schematic of how this is arranged, right? Is there room for identifying those areas where there is a lot of unbalanced views from the parties that contribute input. Because it's one thing to say, here's all the policies, goals, et cetera, and these are supported by the vast majority of the people who participated. And it's quite another to say, well, these over here are really contentious, and to document the contention so that when you do get to the point where this kind of stuff is on the table, you've alerted everybody, you know, pay attention, this is hot button stuff, and we're not going to put it in the closet and make decisions in the dark.
I think that's a really interesting idea. That is not, the Fullerton plan doesn't have any, I've never seen a general plan that does that. I think the intent of that is to say, as I mentioned, as I told Alan, at some point you have to land on something, and a decision has to be made, and a policy needs to be adopted. And if there's a aspect that is just so contentious and so without a middle ground, I think, I don't know, I think that's very challenging. But I can say that in the Fullerton plan and other general plans that I've been a part of, there's never been a discussion of how do we deal with that one particular thing. Is it the Back Bay? Is it the Back Bay? Just out of curiosity?
Is it your experience that those kind of issues get buried in what we're going to call weasel words?
I think typically you would find policies that would be broad enough to be interpreted both directions, is how you would do it. Yeah. So you would find a policy. you would find a policy that the folks that supported one method would say, see, that's the policy that says we're supposed to do this. And you would find everybody else that could find another policy or that same policy read the other way and go, no, 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 that's the reason we shouldn't do this. And there is no general plan that I've ever been a part of that is so crystal clear and specific that you don't get around that. Even in Fullerton, our plan is only 5 years old, 6 years old. We oftentimes will reference a general plan policy in a staff report or a document that says, this policy says, continue the diversity of downtown development. It's one of my favorites. So we bring in a new development. See, this policy supports this project, or this supports that policy. And folks will show up and go, you're putting another bar in downtown. How is that supporting it? How is that more diverse? You've already got 65 of them. And we would say, well, a vacant tenant space, additional, new. And so you can take the same policy and read it two different ways for two different outcomes. And I think that's going to happen. That's inherent in general plans. And so how that gets resolved, the less times you have those, the better, but it's always going to happen. All right, so our plan also includes policies at each level. So when they developed the plan, they developed 4 levels. There is the region and sub-region. And so these are policies that are related to matters that are affecting Fullerton beyond its borders. So we talk a lot about coordination with county government on XYZ, working together with this to accomplish that. We have a lot of this stuff is in our mobility plan because streets, oh, thank you so much. Eventually I just go hoarse and you can't hear me anyway.
Bring the man some cookies.
Watch me eat cookies in front of everybody. So we wanted to make sure there's a regional level. A lot of it is about regional coordination, Fullerton, much like Newport, we're not an island. We need to work with Brea, Placentia, Buena Park. You'll need to work with, the Pacific Ocean and whatever else. So we want to make sure there's regional goals. We also have city level policies. These are focused on programs that are more at the city level, can be carried out within Fullerton's borders. Then we get down to the neighborhood level. Fullerton does not have individual districts or neighborhood associations, but we do have areas within the city that have unique characteristics. Cal State Fullerton is a really good example. What happens around Cal State Fullerton is obviously much different than what happened over on the east side or west side of town, much in more rural areas. We do have some rural, we have some horse property, equestrian property. And so at the neighborhood level, we do have some policies that kind of speak to that sort of micro level. And then lastly, the project level, which is often a specific proposal. Oops, I turned like this one's different. Very specific at the action plan level. So we do have some project level policies. So it goes from very broad to very specific, very wide ranging to very neighborhood focused. So what's great? So there's lots of things that are great, but for sake of time, I cut them down to 3 areas. And the first is user friendly. And so this is something, again, you guys are definitely a little bit ways off in terms of developing your general plan, but I cannot tell you how many times you open up a general plan, and I should have brought an example, and it's a binder, and it's that thick, and you need to and some pages fold out and some pages fold in, and it's heavy with text, there's no maps, there's no graphics, and so you spend a lot of your time, it's just intimidating to look at. One thing Fullerton did is they made it very user-friendly. Another example is there's a user guide. This is within the introduction of the Fullerton plan. And so it's a little bit hard to read, but essentially what it says, this is right at the introduction, it says, why are you here? Why are you opening this document? Why did you click on this link? And so you own property or you live in Fullerton, you're a business owner, you're a community organization, you're a developer, boo. You're an elected or appointed official, you're a City of Fullerton staff member, so everybody in there, another city, or I'm confused, and that one just says call us. There should be a last one like, why did I'm lost. I thought I was trying to see when my trash cans were getting picked up. And then if you have those, you know your role, you step down, you can decide, I want to get, so I'm a developer. I'd like to develop the next question, and I want to develop property in Fullerton. I'm going to go to the community development design element, the historic preservation element, public safety, land use element. And these are what's going to give me some direction on what can I build, what can I design, what can I have in that area. If I'm a business owner, I might be going to the economic development element. So I might be looking at what are there incentives that the city has? Are there programs that the city offers to support economic development? Do I want to participate in the community assessment, which has already occurred? And then you can keep, I haven't even read this one. What does an elected appointed official do? He's going to the goals and policies. Okay, so the elected official is supposed to have kind of more of a broad understanding. So you're looking at the goals and policies, and this is what's going to give you some direction, hopefully, as you're making that land use or you're making that decision. So it's really nice. It's very graphic. It's user-friendly. It's something that I think a lot of people, when they first open a general plan, are a little bit intimidated, and this kind of puts them at least a little bit at ease in terms of understanding. The other big thing.
I didn't lean against the table.
One moment. The other big thing that Fullerton did, and again, I think this is a really, really good idea, and Newport, I should tell you, has a fantastic website, by the way. I think the city provides a lot of information on the website. It's fairly intuitive. I've gone onto City of Newport website a number of times. So I think that's a feather in your cap, but what the city did is they took the Fullerton plan and they broke it out into all those sections, the big 4. Everything has its own hyperlink. Everything downloads separately. So instead of having a 700 megabyte document that takes 5 minutes to download, and good luck if you try to put it on a phone or a mobile device, every element is separated out in its own, but they're all hyperlinked. So you can, if you're looking for just the built environment or you're looking just for the land use map, you can very quickly get to it. And so we hope that a lot of it is very descriptive, and so you can kind of work through the plan very quickly instead of just one button that says Fullerton General Plan and then scroll to page 950 to see, this, that, or the other thing. So user-friendly. The next one is really a big one. I think it's definitely an area of innovation for us, and this is focus areas. And so the focus areas is really what's getting at those, how do you pick areas where you want development to occur while not allowing necessarily development in other areas. So back to Susan's question from before. As part of a community-based planning process, so this was helped develop by the community, they developed 12 geographic focus areas throughout the city. Each focus area has its own planning objectives and goals, so they're not all residential. Some are industrial, some are commercial, some are related to the university, some are related to the downtown. We have a very active downtown in Fullerton, if you've been. It was identified through that community-based process, and it was based on 4 criteria. The first, it's already undergoing some type of transition or transformation, so we want to continue to support that. The second, it's got some special context, whether it's historic, education, cultural, industrial, whatever the case may be. Third is it provides an area of development or options for market interest. Basically, are there people already looking to do development in that area? And then the last is there a potential for enhancement or reinvestment? And so what we came up with, what they came up with, again, not me, is a map that looks like this. And you don't need to be able to read. This is the 12 focus areas here listed out. They've been given titles and names. And what I think is really important is, so 28 square miles of Fullerton, only the areas in color are really the areas where we're projecting growth, development, activity. Now this isn't to say if you own a home in this neighborhood and you want to do an addition, we're going to say, sorry, general plan doesn't allow you to do it. But it is saying if you own property in this neighborhood or you own property in this neighborhood and you want to amend the general plan, amend the zoning code, and build some large development of some kind or another, that there is no focus area policies that would support those land use changes. And so I'm going to get into that a little bit more. But industrial, West Coyote Hills, which is like the Banning Ranch of Fullerton, to the extent that I know a little bit about here. North Harbor Corridor, downtown, the airport, industrial, Southwest Industrial, and this is Cal State Fullerton. And then there's a couple of these corridors, Commonwealth Corridor, Chapman Corridor, and then this is Orangethorpe, and there's some nodes along those areas. So what they did is they took the whole city, and under those criteria identified these geographic areas, and they said this is where we want to project growth, this is where we want to encourage growth, and these are the planning objectives within those areas. And what it allowed us to do is to say, okay, when a developer comes into my office and says, hey Matt, I want to do something super big and super dense, and I want to stick it right here, because there's a commercial property that's up for sale, and it's right at the corner of Euclid and Rosecrans, and gosh, those are two big streets, and it's an underperforming shopping center. I want to do a general plan amendment, and I want to do a zone change, and I want to build townhomes at 22 dwelling units per acre. Where do I sign? Where do I fill out? Where do I send my application? And I get to respond to say, well, first of all, you're always welcome to apply. I always say that. You're always welcome to apply, but I send them this map, and I say, and I showing out, there's your intersection, this is your development. I have no policy direction from the city council, from the community, from anyone. There's nothing in our general plan that says that we should be changing that from anything than what it currently is zoned and currently general planned. And so when you ask, this is always the question developers ask, would the city allow it? Is the city going to say yes? And of course, it's elected officials, the elected officials in the room. It's ultimately your decision. But what I say is, as I'm doing my analysis, this is a document that I'm looking at that says, I don't see any general plan policies to support your zone change, your general plan amendment. And so until the city council or until the planning commission starts to reevaluate those, this is an area that's going to be a challenging project for you to move forward with.
Matt, what exceptions have you seen the city allow that developer to go outside the general plan?
Roy, you're reading my mind. I'm going to show you a map in 1 second.
So
Yes, ma'am.
that's a radical kind of concept. I mean, because in our city council, if it doesn't explicitly say you can't do this, it's a very permissive attitude, very laissez-faire. So what you're describing is actually, I mean, really exciting to me, is that you create the spots where change could be allowed,
right?
And the rest of it is sort of no. And what we've been told, because my mom, you could describe when you talk to the planning department.
Mostly I want him to work for us.
Yeah, I agree.
We're gonna put that resume in for you.
My commute would kill me.
What if we provided a house?
Beachfront property?
Wait a minute, now, hold on, I'm back. Yes, Dennis.
Mama described, Mama described that you had talked to them, and they're basically, the planners in Newport Beach were, well, we never tell anybody that they can't. We just let them apply. So like this huge, massive project, Museum House in McCall, they're not saying to them when they come in, we don't think this is going to pass. But
They
they're saying
chaperone them.
they chaperone them through. So that's really cool.
At least that's the sense we have.
Yeah, but that's what they told you.
Well, I want to make sure it is clear. We never tell somebody anyone can apply.
Right, of course.
Right. So if there's the end story is KB Homes is still looking at that site. They haven't applied yet, but there's still interest. They're welcome to apply. And the truth is, the city council could say, yeah, we think it is a good location, so we're going to approve your general plan. We're going to approve your zone change. But I think the takeaway, a little bit to your point, is I think what happens a lot of times is the planning departments we're looking for policy direction. We don't you shouldn't be analyzing things in a vacuum. Is that project pretty, or is that project not nice? Does it meet the general plan? Is it comply with the zoning code? Is it in an area of economic interest, economic development, opportunity zone? People call them a lot of different things, but if the policy is that there is no policy, and so whoever submits an application gets to get their turn in front of the council, and good luck to you, and if they like it, then it must be good. I think that it's difficult to implement, and it's probably difficult to understand from the community. So it would speak to why you need an updated general plan. Yes,
You
ma'am.
talk about community feedback, community input, over 40 meetings to come up with this design. It's all agreed by the community and the city council and everyone.
Agreed is kind of a stretch, but yes,
No,
at
And
least
everybody.
reviewed.
Even to come up with something like this, who was in the community? You know what percent were homeowners, what percent were renters? Did they volunteer? I mean, they went through this 40 meetings process.
They did. So the General Plan Advisory Committee were volunteers, probably much like yourselves. They were appointed and selected. So if you were a neighborhood activist or someone who was very interested, possibly you serve on a commission or a committee, Planning Commission, Parks and Rec Commission, Economic Development. We were shooting for a balance of property owners, business owners, owners and renters, although as you probably have experienced, owners tend to be much more engaged and active in development. Renters are a little bit harder to get to be involved. So the goal is a very nice cross section. The reality is it typically is people that are active and activated and interested. And so when you're doing outreach, you try to reach all the people that show up to meetings on Saturday afternoons at fire stations, but you also need the people that are their opinion is just as important, their feedback is just as important, but they're at their kid's soccer game, or they don't think that, or they work Saturdays. And so that outreach process is just so critical because you want to make sure you're hearing as balanced a feedback as possible, because it's what shapes this document. And actually I'll point out a couple of examples where a small but passionate group of people actually steered this document a little bit of a different direction than I think would have typically happened. Dennis, here's your hand up.
Yeah, so this is tagging on a little bit about what we said about what she was saying about how it's kind of flipped. In the staff that deals with this, you and your contemporaries in your department, do you get that attitude from above? Because I'm curious in Fullerton how you feel comfortable as a staff member saying, well, you can always apply, but I'm not a policy. So thank you very much. Whereas, as you heard in Newport, it's more like, we're gonna figure out any way we possibly can to get your project through. I mean, that's really a lot of the attitude. Those are really very different.
Sure, absolutely.
Where are you getting your influence directly or maybe just implied in the city of Fullerton to make those decisions?
I think the for me personally, it came from our community development director, so my boss. I think it could come from even a higher level. The city manager plays a large role in that. The city council plays a very large role in that.
Right.
But for Fullerton, current Fullerton planning, which is kind of the group that I oversee, it came from the community development director, and it really comes from a unique these documents matter. We spent a lot of time making them. They were theoretically a representation of the community's goals and the city council's goals, and so our role as government officials is to implement those documents. And so I never feel uncomfortable saying, if there isn't, I'll tell you, the opposite does happen. If somebody comes in and wants to build something right there and it's a focus area and the planning objectives say increase housing, I can tell them very confidently, we have planning policy that says this project. Now you might have community opposition because the people that live there might say, we didn't vote for that general plan, we didn't think that was a good idea in 2012, and we still don't think it's an idea. So it works both ways, but it's a way for us to ground our decision making in a document that has been approved and blessed by the government.
Let me follow just slightly. So the wording of the document has allowed you as an implementer of that document, because of this, what I would say the solidity of the document, you're very comfortable doing that. We find that in our situation, the staff has maybe felt able to, or maybe even needed to interpret. When we've got conversations with staff all the way up to the manager in the planning department, they always say, well, it's our job to interpret the general plan, interpret it. Do you feel that you're interpreting the general plan?
Occasionally. Sometimes those policies, as we kind of talk, policies can be written in a way that it's not always clear. There's a great example, just met with somebody the other day on Chapman here. The planning objectives for the Chapman corridor say preserve and protect the commercial corridor and commercial uses, and the planning objective right underneath says increase opportunities for housing. And so he says, I want to take down, I got this vacant piece of property, I want to put a 4-story, 70 dwelling units per acre apartment complex there. And I said, well, it does say protect commercial corridor for commercial uses. And he goes, yeah, but the next one below that says provide opportunities for increased housing. So in those cases,
was that like do you think that was like an oops in the plan?
I don't. What I think it represents is that this corridor goes all the way from Berkeley to the university, and not every planning objective is accomplished on every parcel.
So how did you answer his question, or his challenge?
Well, we're still working on that.
You may find middle ground. That's where you.
So the middle ground maybe it's about a 3-acre parcel, and it faces on a commercial corridor, and so the middle ground may be that he can put commercial on the front portion of his property and then potentially residential on the back portion. And now we're satisfying both components.
Having a conversation.
And you just need to have that conversation.
Yeah.
And so there are contradictions. There are apparent contradictions. Some of these areas are very large. I heard somebody say that. So not every planning objective is accomplished on every parcel. And so sometimes it's hard because you look at 4 things and go, there's no way we can do all that on this piece. Well, you're not supposed to. That's not what the planning objectives are. They're saying for this area, these are the types of development, this is the type of growth, this is the type of things we'd be looking for. So the question was, did it work? I think somebody asked, did it work? How's it going? And the answer is, it mostly works, shockingly. So this is just a superimposed this is just residential development. I superimposed residential developments and the focus areas. So what you'll see, hopefully, is that the vast majority of developments, don't look at that, are occurring within the focus areas. And so that could be the result of that's where their properties were that were eligible for development. That's because of a number of things. I choose to believe, at least in part, that occurred because that is how we implemented the general plan. So the question was, how many times does it happen where it's not in a focus area but it happens anyway? That's a good example.
What was that one up on the top?
17 up on Rolling Hills. That was an old church site that the church sold to a single family home developer. He built 17 small lot single family homes. This is a residential care facility for the elderly, so it's an assisted living. So it counts as residential development, but it's certainly not residential development as you might think of it. So I think this, and there's other, this is 2016, so there's another project that's right there in that focus area. I've got another project right there.
What's that one in the industrial area, the 36?
This one is a really bad example. I'll digress just for a moment because it's through a community of friends and Pathways of Hope. It's a affordable housing project with some mental health components. It's in an industrial zone. That focus area does not call for industrial, and so we did a general plan amendment and a zone change.
So Matt, what you're showing us is that in 7 years, the Planning Commission of the City of Fullerton and the City Council of the City of Fullerton has not abused the general plan.
As it relates to development, there are very few examples of projects that have occurred that have not been, at least theoretically, an implementation of the general plan. So is it 100% successful? It's not.
Never gonna be.
Nothing's gonna be. Is this a good example of why did you put houses in an industrial area? Yeah, it kind of is.
But I think that's a good exception to make. I think you did the right thing.
Well, thank you. It's a beautiful project. It's almost done.
Yeah.
So I think it speaks to, the question you might ask yourself is, would it even work? Is this working? I think this map is starting to show, and there's a big industrial development that I got cut off that I'm going to talk about later. I think what this shows is, yeah, it's mostly working, and it's allowing us to keep these huge chunks of rural single-family homes exactly the way they are.
Where do you live?
I live in Whittier. To be up closer to that like E or
Oh,
N.
that's right. I knew that. I knew that.
Over the hills.
We had that
Yeah.
discussion.
Yes, ma'am.
That would
Okay.
be.
What about design? Do you have design standards? Do you have any kind of design review?
We do have design review. We have limited design standards. I wish we had more.
Okay.
Again, Matt unfiltered. I wish we had more.
Okay. So what do you have and what don't you have that you'd like to have?
Before Fullerton, I worked for the City of Santa Ana. And the Santa Ana in 2006 adopted citywide design guidelines. And it's 9 chapters of just really, really good information. It touches on single family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, historic, downtowns, and so what it does is it stops the negotiation when you meet with a developer or an architect. What we do in Fullerton, and I'm not sure how Newport Beach handles it, a developer will come in and propose something. Fast drive-through is a great example. They'll propose a drive-through, and we have no design standards that says you have to have room for this many cars, or your front door needs to face out to the street, or you can't turn your back to this or that, and so design guidelines take away some of that negotiation of saying, like, please, could you please make sure there's at least 6 cars for this Starbucks? Which is ridiculous because there'd be 50 cars for that Starbucks. Could you please put an additional material? Could you please not do stucco box, a 2-story stucco box? And so we're ultimately very successful because it works for the developer most often as well. But if you had some really clear design guidelines and design standards, I think that would go a long way. A design review committee is that next evolution to say, not only do we have design standards, but there's this body of professionals that are going to be reviewing that aspect of a plan.
So would that be part of the general plan? I know Nancy was talking about form-based, zoning or general planning or whatever it was. I mean, is that something that goes in the general plan, or is that something that's just implemented as part of the general plan?
It would be implemented as part of the general plan. So form-based zoning, form-based codes, that's in your municipal code, your zoning documents. And then design guidelines kind of live in that middle ground. They would typically be codified by, the municipal code would say compliance with the City of Newport Beach design guidelines. And then that document kind of lives separate of the municipal code, separate of the general plan.
And that's what Santa Ana does?
That's what Santa Ana did, yeah. Great, it's a really, really good document. I would encourage you to steal as necessary. So, last thing that's great, and then we'll talk a little bit more. I'm sorry I'm taking up a lot of your time.
No, we've
Implementation.
our
So
questions.
the implementation plan, back to Susan's question, it's a short-term action plan. It's specified 3 to 5 years. It has specified a lead and secondary implementing department. So it wasn't just what specific projects, it was which departments are going to carry them out. And it was a roadmap. And in theory, it was updated by the city council annually, biannually, as part of its annual goal setting process. Typically, a city council will go into a retreat where they'll kind of lay out their goals for the coming fiscal year or the coming calendar year. And so the intent when this was adopted was the city council would kind of get together. We would go over the action plan. What did we like? What did we not like? What did we do? What did we not do? And then small lot housing. And then within then it says prepare a community-based design standards as an objective reference to implement the Fullerton plan during city review. Can I get some more water? Somebody? And so the concept was this was going to occur. Community development was the lead agency, and within 3 to 5 years, we would be bringing back this proposed citywide design guidelines for city council consideration. It's been 6 years. We didn't do it. Campus planning, and so it goes down, and it goes for each policy. Thank you very much, Dennis. It goes through each goal, through each policy, and it lays out specific actions that were taken to accomplish that policy. So this is a long document. It's almost as long as the general plan itself because it lays out every policy and actions to implement. I went through it briefly as I was preparing for this presentation. I am sad to say the number of things that have been accomplished is not very high. There are some things. We didn't ignore it altogether, but the actual number of accomplished actions is not very high. And when we are questioned on that, and now it says at the beginning of this document, it recognizes not all actions will be accomplished. They need to be amended. So it's not a question of legal authority. Can you be sued for not doing that? It acknowledges that not everything will be done. But I think the failure is that this is an example of something that was a really good idea, and then there was very little follow through.
Who's responsible for the follow through?
It was each.
No, who's the person? There's got to be one person. Is it the community development director?
Bus on TV.
No. There isn't just one person in many cases.
Who manages keeping it updated then and maintained?
I think that's the other failing, is that the Fullerton plan got adopted and it touched on a lot of other departments, Parks and Recreation, the police department, the fire department, community development, city manager. And while community development does review this on a regular basis, those other departments typically don't. And so you would pull this action plan up and look in the safety element and try to see if the City of Fullerton Police Department has implemented a community-based policing program, and you could show that to the chief of police and say, hey chief, how did it go? He might not even know it exists. And so I think one thing as citizens, and so as sort of an unfiltered moment, we need to recognize that we don't want to put in things that can't be done, and we don't want to set ourselves up to fail. And I think this was a really good idea, and the people that were sitting around developing this action plan were like, the next 3 to 5 years are going to be awesome, and we're going to kick some ass for the next 5 years, and in 5 years we're all going to sit around and talk about how great we did. And 5 years later, in 2017, you could open this up and we have accomplished 25%.
So the community is at the table creating the action plan with staff?
They typically were not. This aspect was done mostly in-house because the specific actions are typically they're city-sponsored documents and actions that wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense to the community.
Does that cross-reference to the budget?
That was the other idea. The idea was through the annual goal setting, you were supposed to attach some dollars to this. And so, again, that's something else that just has not really come through.
So, at the end of the day, doesn't it go to the city manager?
I know.
Yeah.
Or is it city, and obviously the city manager works with the council, but it still seems to me that's a management thing, not a council thing. Council's doing policy.
Mm-hmm.
So, to her question, I would think it goes to city manager, and the city manager, now he or she may have reasons to not have certain things as a priority.
Right, exactly.
And I understand that's part of management, but I still think the buck stops at the city manager.
You're absolutely right. And we just got a new city manager in July of last year. And one of the first things after actually a pretty heavy turnover of city managers, I'm not sure how stable Newport's city manager has been prior to this, but very stable.
Very stable.
And stability in that position is just really, you don't realize how beneficial it is until it's gone. And so, yeah, our new city manager comes from City of Huntington Beach. He's fantastic, and one of the first things he did was he looked at some of these goals and he picked out 8, and he's going to say these are the 8 that we're going to try to accomplish in the next fiscal year. And a couple of them actually didn't come from the implementation plan. A couple of them are things that have developed over the last 6 years. They're new things. But at least 3 of them that I'm aware of were things that he saw and hear and said, okay, we're not going to do all of these. We're never going to get them all done. We're going to do these ones. And so, and then you point to your department heads and say, okay, here's how this is what I expect to see, and then, kind of filters down from there. Yes?
I was just going to kind of comment that it's not always pointing to staff to say they're not doing a good job implementing, because if the example, and we'll use your focus areas, or I see them as kind of opportunity areas, if it says build mixed use or higher density in this particular area, the city doesn't really do that unless they own the land and they partner with somebody.
Right.
So that's why they have to wait for a project to come forward. And so that's another reason that a policy may not have been implemented, is because it just didn't come up yet. And so I just wanted to deflect a little from the staff side, that it's not always somebody at the staff level that, is the problem. So it could be that, there's a recession and so nobody's putting anything forward.
Exactly. And so this, the recession and the dissolution of redevelopment, which happened in 2011, 2 big wrenches in a 3 to 5 year action plan when nobody was building anything from 2009 to 2011. And after 2011, the city lost probably its greatest tool for financing new development. Affordable housing.
Yes.
And some infrastructure too that goes along with affordable housing. And so those are things that you don't necessarily have control of. This is way too far into the weeds for you guys, but I will say that one of the other things that I think that we did was really good was we created 3 new community development types. These are land use classifications, so residential, industrial, commercial. They created 3 new ones which allowed for mixed use. So it's downtown mixed use, neighborhood center mixed use, and urban center mixed use. It's what allows for a little bit, these were areas that were going to be where we went a little bit higher in density, a little bit higher heights, intensity, floor area ratios, etc. What they didn't do is they didn't actually attach them to any properties. And so the plan created the framework to have this general plan designation, this land use type, but they didn't go out and say, Melanie's house is now a downtown mixed use. And I think that was really smart, because when you actually start changing people's zoning or changing their general plan, that's very complicated. There's a lot of implications. But what Fullerton did was they said, we're going to create the framework. We're going to build the box. And then future planners, future developments, future actions are going to come along that we're not going to try to predict or project. And we're going to have this as a tool that a developer can use to achieve some level of development. Because before this, there was no mixed use general plan designation. And so you start doing these little workarounds where you're giving it a weird designation.
So what I think I heard you say is that there's no property that has that mixed use attached to it. It's something that you can apply and say, I'd like to do a mixed use. You have to do a general plan.
They do a general plan amendment. Yep,
because
exactly.
In our city, what happened is in the last general plan update in 2006, is they just put mixed use in a lot of places, and mixed use basically lets them get past the rules. So those affordable apartments at San Joaquin Hills, they used to be commercial, but it was a mixed use designation, and so they, without having a general plan update, they just converted them, boom, to housing units. So our city has used that as a workaround to try to get around the rules.
And so that's not too uncommon. I think what saved Fullerton in that regard is that the Fullerton City Council at this time and currently is very much a little bit of control. And so what they said was, we're okay with this occurring somewhere potentially, but when it does, it needs to come back.
I think it's a great idea.
It needs to come back. And so since its adoption, we actually have done We've done one property, a nice, really nice, my project, really, really nice mixed-use project near downtown. We've done, I think, 1 or 2 of these, and maybe 1 of these, maybe at least 1 of those. And so it hasn't exploded. You know, in 6 years it hasn't exploded, but it's allowed the city, it's allowed a development to come in, and now there is but we're not going to change the general plan designation of any properties. It's one method. So I've got 2 case studies. This is one up on the north part of town, so Harbor Boulevard and Imperial. It was 44 acres. It was totally vacant, just a dirt pile, and we had a proposal to come in to rezone it to residential, put a nice big single-family mixed-use, little commercial component, kind of your standard residential change. It is in the north, this is a focus area, so this is a little cutout. This is the North Harbor industrial focus area. And so city staff and the city council were actually able to reference the goals and planning objectives for that focus area to say, we don't think residential is not what we're looking for in this area, and thank you very much for your proposal. We'd like to see industrial. It talks about, I took off the focus area goals, encouraging well-paying jobs, diversifying the industrial base. And so the city council ultimately said no thanks to that residential development. Fast forward a few years, this whole site is now currently under construction. They're doing 987,000 square feet of brand new tilt-up industrial. It's going to generate 1,000+ jobs. It's going to put a bunch of people to work, and it's going to continue to expand Fullerton's base. And the way they were able to make that decision, or at least one of the ways they were able to support that decision, was to say, we thought about this. This is an area we've planned as a focus area, and it's planned for industrial. So thank you, residential, but we're going to keep this industrial. And lo and behold, 3 years later, this is under construction right now. The reverse is that project on Rosecrans and Euclid that I mentioned. It's this 11-acre commercial site. We've received half a dozen proposals to rezone it to multifamily and mixed use. And again, not within a focus area. And so what we've said is there's no policy direction to ever make the change in the general plan or the zoning to support it. Now, what's happening is it's a vastly underutilized commercial center. If you went there today, it's kind of a downer. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is going to be a time in the future where the city council might have to say, commercial on a corridor, commercial has really changed. The way people shop has changed, Amazon, online shopping. And so maybe a commercial center that's kind of not on a freeway or a major thoroughfare isn't viable. But at least for today, we continue to tell people that this is not a focus area, and so there is no current policy support for that. So in terms of how we are using it, how we are implementing it, that's kind of 2 good examples. One to say no and we got something, and this one we get a lot of applications and we are continuing to kind of recommend against them. So last thing, what's not so great? Policies, we've already touched on all of these, so I'm going to zip through them. Policies are often not specific enough, can be interpreted both ways. Happens all the time. You try your best to avoid it, but occasionally someone can look at the same policy and say, that says that I should do it, and then the same person can say, that says you should never do it. Starting every policy with support projects programs is often confusing. We've talked about that already. The implementation strategy was intended to be regularly updated to reassert policy direction. City Council was supposed to be looking at this. We haven't, and as a result, the implementation plan has really kind of fallen to the wayside. And then lastly, we've had very limited success on the action plan. Now we are accomplishing some things, but when it was originally constructed, it was a really, really robust roadmap, and what it's turned into is sort of a justification for stuff that we were probably already planning to do.
Matt?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you go back there, that implementation strategy, what is that? I mean, is that the plan?
It's the 3rd phase of the Fullerton plan. So
okay.
it's the goals and policies, and then the implementation. Okay. That's the actions element of that
okay,
document.
So how do you feel about that? About that not being done regularly? I don't understand, because that's going on here too. It's just they stamp it and send it on implementation. I mean, that's really important.
It is.
Okay.
I think it's something that it's easy.
How do you measure yourself?
Exactly.
Or your duties or your city.
Right.
Against the general plan.
And that's exactly what it was intended to do. And if it were updated annually or every 2 years as part of the capital improvement plan or as part of a budget cycle, it would create a really, really nice focused way to kind of open up this document, and the elected officials or the city could go down the list and say, okay, what are we okay, fiscal year 18-19. All right, guys, what are we doing? How much is that gonna cost? How much money do we need to budget for that accomplishment or this action? So I think it's a really great tool, and it's a missed opportunity.
Is it because you don't have enough staff to do it? Because one of those things is like, it ain't broke, don't fix it, or?
I think partially it is a little bit of a staffing issue. It's a funding issue. Fullerton's budget, like many other cities, is very, very tight. And so how you pay, some of the things in that action plan would require the hiring of a consultant or paying some other person to do, and the money's not there. I think one of the things, again, Matt Unfiltered, it went by a couple years with no one doing it, and then we changed city managers and we changed community development directors 3 times, and now it sits at the end of our document, and
Can't catch it out.
yeah, it starts to feel like we're never going to get there. So why don't look at it too closely, you know? Yes, ma'am.
That's not fair, that there is no individual. And yeah, you can say the city manager, buck stops here, but everybody's so busy. And it's almost like you have to say, one staff person, this is very important part of your job. No matter what else we throw on here, you must bring us back here and say,
Yep.
okay, we've got to start planning for this with you, because without somebody do that,
It's
it's
a
just,
project management job.
yeah, there's just too much to do and it gets lost.
Yeah. And if you're not making it a priority,
And council's not.
and as a person, as a city who's also short-staffed, asking, a lot of times I tell people that I'm just trying to keep the trains running on time, and so.
Do you think it takes more time straightening it out than it is doing it, though? It seems like from a staff perspective.
I think it's probably about half and half. Yeah, it would take a lot of time to get kind of figured out where we're going, and it would also take a lot of time to maybe
If
start.
if you were just starting day one and you kept up with it, would you find improvements or synergies in staff time because it got kept up?
I think there are. I think there definitely are a few
You
things.
could justify the cost with the savings in from just day-to-day work.
I think there are definitely some things in the action plan, especially as it relates to community development, that if we had been able to implement and adopt those documents, it would actually make our job easier on a daily basis. Design standards. So one of the ones in there is create design templates for new small lot construction. We spend a lot of time working with, where if we could just had a design manual to pull out and are you A, B, or C? Here you go. So I think there's something there. You're absolutely right. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that the plan, kind of the reach was further than the grasp, that it was too ambitious, that it was out of sync with budgetary and manpower constraints?
I think that's a factor of starting in 2007 and ending in 2012. Because in 2007, we had 38% more staff. We had a city manager that had been stable at the city for many, many years. We had a community development director who was very, very well respected, very, 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 very progressive. And so we embarked on we embarked on a journey with all the right tools, and then just got waylaid a number of times over the next 5 years. And so the document we ended up with, I think, probably does exceed our ability to implement it. And that's sort of the new reality. So. Yes, sir.
Well, first, are you at the end? Because I had some questions for the end.
So this is my closing quote to you guys. Plan for growth. You would rather be driving the bus than getting run over by it. So growth is 50 million people are going to be added to California over the next 20 years or whatever. You hear a lot of these numbers. Housing is at an all-time high. There's a housing crisis. We need to be adding 100, 200,000 units a year for the next 10 years. And so the cities that embrace that perspective and plan for growth will be the ones that are much happier with the result than the cities that say, I don't want to allow anything to happen, because eventually the state of California is going to come in and start adopting laws that are going to take all of the power out of cities' hands, and you can see that starting to happen with accessory dwelling units. There's a number of affordable housing laws that were passed recently that limit the amount of time and influence that cities have, and to the extent that every city can start to plan for their growth, you'd much rather plan and put it in the places you want it than eventually have a developer come in and not have to even ask for permission and approval and put it where they want it.
Yeah, but we're gonna have a new state come November, right?
Yeah.
We're Southern yeah, that's right. The Republic of Southern California shall maybe have a different, entirely different perspective. So somebody told that to me once and it stuck in my mind. You'd rather be driving the bus than getting run over by it.
So I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
One of them comes right down to the words in the general plan. So we have issues in our general plan that there's waffle words, and you've heard the weasel words and stuff like that. So there's shall, will, may, can. I mean, you know, there's words that give a lot of discretion. There's words that don't give discretion. Is that an issue in your general plan? You felt that was dealt with pretty well?
It is an issue. It was an issue. I think whenever there was an opportunity to make things a little more weaselly, we took it.
Okay.
It says a lot of things like support,
Yeah.
encourage.
Yeah. Interpretive words that can be interpreted.
I think in there, and sometimes you have to do that. But I think to the extent that you can convince your city and your staff to take a hard line and say shall and will and must when there are things that are important, and then take a little bit of a cop out and say encourage and should and support when it's not less clear, it's all the better. But there are unintended consequences. I think Dorothy or Susan mentioned. And so understanding that balance is, some cities do better than others, but nobody does it right.
And then the other question is planned communities. You have planned communities, and we have a lot of problem in Newport with basically planned communities used to get away with a whole lot of stuff. We have, one of the requirements is it's supposed to be 10 acres, right? Well, we have a couple of projects, the only way they got 10 acres was vertical. I mean, literally, they put planned communities on 1 acre. And is that going on in Fullerton? Because I know it's going on in other places in the state.
We do have some. Ours is supposed to be a minimum of 40 acres, but we have specific plans of 4 acres, 3 acres. It's not it's not good planning. It's not a good policy approach.
We have a planned community of one.
They're terribly abused here. Terribly abused.
I imagine it is. City of Yorba Linda is almost exclusively made up of little gated planned communities. Yeah. So some cities it's more of a problem than others. It's difficult to enforce. Over time that becomes very difficult to regulate because everybody's playing by their own unique set of rules.
So but Fullerton, you don't feel you're having a big problem with that?
It's not the worst I've heard.
40 acres starting off is pretty big.
It's pretty big, and so we don't see a lot of, we don't have a lot of them, we don't see a lot of them, and we discourage them where we can.
Great job.
Also with gated communities. I'm not a big fan of gated communities. I don't know where you guys come down on that.
Well, we have a fair number of them.
I'm sure you have quite a bit.
So in your focus area for Coyote Hills, there's obviously a lot of contention.
Yes.
I mean, how do you see how that's worked out for that?
Oh dear, I have no idea. Coyote Hills.
I know you don't know how it's going.
Coyote Hills has its own specific plan, and so it's also under lawsuit right now, and it's been going on since the 70s. You guys I feel like that's a Banning Ranch thing.
But where's Banning Ranch is solved, kind of.
Oh, you've solved it. Oh,
well,
congratulations.
It'll be back. It's not solved.
It's been stalled.
It'll be back.
So, Coyote.
I mean, they can always come back with.
So city is trying to acquire as much of Coyote Hills as possible to preserve it for open space. And so,
How did that happen?
Well, I'm actually taking change and spare change at the end of this meeting.
You said try.
Trying. We are trying to, and so we are working with the state senators and different things to get grants. The Mountains and Regions Conservancy, and it's an all of the above approach. But we're trying to consolidate enough money to potentially buy a big chunks of it.
Right.
But it's been going on for 40 years, and there's no clear end in sight. Yes, ma'am.
Has the momentum picked up for buying this property? I mean, is there a more green city council now that, you know, has the long-term?
Are you talking about Coyote Hills still?
No, I'm talking about Fullerton, yes.
Yes.
Coyote Hills, right, and the Fullerton City Council. Are they more innovative thinking and more, you know, planning for the future with this attitude?
I think so. I mean, they're supportive. The majority of the council is supportive for the acquisition of as much of Coyote Hills as possible. And so that's
huge.
That's now, you know, where it ends up, it's a lot of money. And so where it ends up, there was a ballot measure in 2014 regarding it, and it's a very, very contentious, but to the extent that the city could accommodate get enough money to buy out land and keep it open space, I think that's generally where the majority of the council would want to go. Yeah. Yes, sir.
You guys mentioned that technology was a part of your planning strategy. Have you guys started to do white papers for the driverless car and what the impacts of that's going to be on the community and economic development, all that sort of stuff?
No.
Have you?
No, and we should.
Okay.
Fullerton, like many cities, is kind of putting their head in the sand on driverless autonomous vehicles. And it's something that's going to happen in the nearer future than many people think. But we have not taken any official actions or even planning for it, and we should.
Great. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.